The U.S. and many European countries have continued to isolate Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, but many African nations have remained neutral. Almost half of the countries who chose to abstain from condemning the Kremlin's actions at the UN General Assembly meeting earlier this month are in Africa. So joining me now to discuss is BBC Africa correspondent Catherine Byaruhanga. Catherine, thanks for joining us. What are some of the reasons the majority of African countries would want to stay neutral in condemning Russia?
Exactly. The constant refrain that we've heard from countries like Zimbabwe in Southern Africa, Tanzania, just neighboring to Kenya, where I am right now, is that they're choosing to take a neutral position in this conflict. They say that it's essential that every country has a sovereign right to make its own decision in deciding what they think about this conflict in Ukraine. But they also say that they want to make space for dialogue. And just pointing back to that UN resolution that you mentioned there, they said it was too one-sided, it was too much against Russia, and they didn't feel that it would allow space for dialogue, which I think is the only way that this conflict will come to an end. But there are also security considerations. Take a country like Mali in West Africa. Now, this is a country that has been blighted by an Islamist insurgency for more than a decade. These are Islamists that are backed by ISIL and Al-Qaeda. In recent months, Mali's government has fallen out with Western countries that were supporting it in this fight. Now is heavily reliant on the Russian mercenary group Wagner, which is now helping Mali's government. And so it also chose to abstain in this UN vote. But having said that, there are key powerful countries on the continent like Kenya, Nigeria, Egypt that have condemned Russia. And Kenya's ambassador to the UN Security Council, Kenya's representative to the UN Security Council, made a passionate defense for Ukraine's sovereignty. As a former colonized nation, it said Russia should not try and oppress its weaker neighbor.
And you bring up Egypt, which is vulnerable too. They have a large subsidized bread program, so they depend on a lot of wheat, which brings me to the economic pressures that some of these countries are facing. Maybe they are dependent on grain from Ukraine and Russia. Maybe they're dependent on fuel. Maybe it's fertilizer. And you point out something that we're talking about countries that in some countries there is already some instability. So then when you add economic pressure, you increase their vulnerability, you increase the likelihood of things becoming more unstable. Can you just talk a little bit more about the domino effect when it comes to the economic pressures that some of these countries are facing?
Yes, some countries might try to be politically neutral. We're starting to see the impact of this conflict on the continent. So, for example, fuel prices have risen in South Africa, the continent's most developed economy, in Uganda as well. But looking at the price of wheat, of bread, this is something that can cause political instability and something that governments are really scared about. So, for example, in Egypt, we've seen that wheat prices, they rely on wheat from Ukraine and Russia. Wheat prices have gone up 25%. And today, the Egyptian government is asking for support from the International Monetary Fund to be able to stabilize its economy. Now, just south from Egypt is Sudan, and there we've had a political crisis for 3 years. This was triggered by bread prices, by wheat prices, and it led to protests, and the former president, Omar al-Bashir, was overthrown. Today, as we speak, there are more protests in Sudan right now. That's mainly because of political dynamics. But increasing prices are once again determining how people think about how their country should be governed. Now, the African Development Bank, which supports so many countries on this continent, is trying to raise $1 billion. Now, it says it's going to use that money to support the production of other grains like rice, like maize, to make sure that when there is a fall in supply of wheat, maybe countries will be able to support themselves with these other grains.
Catherine, very illuminating, and I think it's really important for people to understand the ripple effect of a war happening in just one area, and it goes beyond Europe. So I'm really glad we were able to have you on today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.